Welcome to the Education Policy Equation. I'm your host, Jack Murdoch. My guest today is Matt Beienburg, Director of Education Policy at the Goldwater Institute. He's also the director of the Institute's Van Sitter Center for Constitutional Advocacy. He's been published in a number of outlets. He's written widely on school choice, and he's been an important figure in the ESA debate in Arizona. Matt, thank you so much for being on the program.
Sure, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me on.
So I think I'd like to start this conversation by covering the ESA or Empowerment Scholarship account versus voucher distinction. So I think it'd be great if you could do two things. Firstly, just explain the difference between how an ESA works and how a voucher works. And then secondly, explain why that's an important difference. Because to my mind, it didn't seem like an important difference at first. And the more I read into it, the more I understood in terms of some of the legal battles that this has been through, why that is an important distinction.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'm happy to kind of jump in on both of these. So ESA stands for Education Savings Account, or in Arizona, we call them an Empowerment Scholarship Account, which is different from a voucher. So a voucher essentially says, here is a check, you can take this to a private school and it'll help pay for some of your tuition. With an ESA, it says, actually, what we're going to do is we're going to take a portion of what the state was going to spend on your student to send them to a public school. We're going to deposit that into an account, kind of like a checking account, essentially, or a health savings account is an analogy a lot of people are familiar with. We're going to put that into an account for the family. It's about $7,000 for a typical student in Arizona, and say, you now have access to this account and you can use it for any number of educational expenses. So you can use that for private school tuition if you'd like, but you can also use that for things like tutoring, special education therapies, curriculum materials, textbooks, all sorts of stuff. So there's a kind of policy practical difference that's significant, and there is a legal distinction that you kind of alluded to. In terms of the legal distinction, one of these, a lot of states have rules around saying the funding can only go to a public school, or you can't have this, you're not allowed to prioritize or put resources into systems outside of that. And there's some legal history around that. The ESA program, on the other hand, is not providing funding to a private school, right? It's providing funding to a family. That family is free to use it for any number of things, right? If they want to go to a private school, that's great. If they don't, that's great. And the reason that that's significant, not just as a legal distinction, but in practice, we saw this during COVID-19, right? So many families who found themselves suddenly basically de facto homeschoolers, right? When their schools shut down, or even after they had reopened, doing things like rolling quarantines where they were sticking healthy kids and saying, sorry, you can't be in class because maybe someone in your grade level or something tested positive for COVID. We saw this disruption for the better part of a couple of years in a lot of states, where families were left trying to juggle this and their kids were, being sent home or struggling. And a lot of families said, kind of enough is enough. Like, my kid is being stuck in front of a Zoom screen, or they're not being given the education that they need. And a lot of families fell out of the system. A lot of families then pursued these options and said, look, if my school district's not going to prioritize my kids' learning, they're not going to meet their needs academically. They're not going to meet the sort of social interaction. We saw all sorts of mental health problems arise as a result of the pandemic closures. These families said, all right, I'm going to take things into my own hands. I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to work with my own kids, or I'm going to find a tutor in my area, or I'm going to band together with other parents because we're all in the same boat. And we're going to try to find resources for our kids. Something like the ESA program says, you can get on this program. And even if there's not a private school near you, or you don't want to, enroll in a private school, you have this option to pursue home-based education or micro school education, or any of these different venues. You're not just stuck hoping that the public schools reopen, or maybe the public charter schools that have a huge wait list will somehow let your student in. So it's a huge benefit, kind of regardless of what form of education a family wants to go in.
So you mentioned there that COVID had a huge impact. Do you think that's what's driving the growth of ESA programs in other states? Because if you look at the theory of behind ESAs, it's similar theory behind vouchers, which has been around for decades, since the 60s, really, I think. But all of a sudden, it seems like as a national phenomenon, Arizona was sort of at the forefront, but we're seeing all sorts of states now. I know Iowa, West Virginia. Do you think it's mainly COVID that's driving this sort of rapid growth in states' ESA or voucher type programs? Not all states are pursuing ESA programs, some are pursuing voucher programs.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's COVID. I would say it is largely the response by the education establishment to COVID, right? And that's an important distinction, right? Because we tend to say, and just for shorthand, right? We say, well, COVID caused this. These were policy decisions that were made, right? Like shutting down the schools and keeping them shut down wasn't something that happened because of COVID. It was something that happened because of the decision makers, right? And we saw this. We had folks like, Governor DeSantis in Florida, in Georgia, in Arizona, folks who said, we're going to reopen our schools. Like, we think our kids need in-person learning. The established conventional wisdom at that point, we saw the teachers' unions out protesting, right? They were putting out fake obituaries of their teachers saying, if you make us come to school, you're killing teachers. We saw coffins, gravestones, all sorts of antics. Them putting out posts saying that school reopening was rooted in misogyny and racism, right? All of these radical things. This wasn't because of COVID. This was the response of those in power. And so the devastation and the frustration that caused for families and for students, I think absolutely was a catalyst for a lot of states to say, yeah, we've been talking about this for a long time. States like Arizona had, partial programs across the country, kind of a patchwork of different programs for students in this group or that group. And I think lawmakers kind of heard the frustration of parents and the cry of parents on behalf of their students saying, this is not working, right? And we saw, there's a couple of elements of this, right? It's not just the academics, which have suffered. You can look at the NAEP scores and everything, that the scores have been horrific. But also parents saw a lot of the content that was being taught in the classroom. They're suddenly, virtually in the classroom with the student, where they can kind of see, hey, what's my kid actually doing day to day? And we saw parents who have since come forward and say, it was clear that my kid wasn't learning reading, that the programs that were happening were off base. We can get into that a little bit more in the segment here. But also a lot of them saying, a lot of the content that was being taught to my kids seemed like it was kind of political. It wasn't, actual academic content. And so parents had a lot of concerns about that too. So this kind of two-pronged assault on parents of your kids are being left behind academically, and your kids are being fed a lot of stuff that really has no business being in the classroom. It's not advancing their academics. I think really galvanized parents, again, to say, this is not working. And I think lawmakers heard that that message. And yeah, we've now seen about 10 states that have moved to this idea of, we're going to provide universal choice for our families. We're not going to pick winners and losers. Everybody has the same opportunities.
Yeah, so that's exactly what I'd like to get into next, because for Arizona, we've had ESAs around for a while. We've also had some voucher type programs, school tuition organizations. That's a voucher type organization for students in need. But what's new is universal access. So why have universal access instead of just targeting these programs towards the neediest students or the students who have disabilities? Why expand this so that we've got this really radical new program in which anyone in Arizona can take advantage of this?
Sure. Great question. And that same question applies when lawmakers about 30 years ago were contemplating allowing public charter schools to start, right? These are things that are public schools, but they operate entirely independently of the school district, right? If you go to a charter school, all of your funding goes with you to that charter school. It leaves your school district and goes with you. Arizona now has the most robust charter school sector of any state in the country. We have about a quarter of our public school kids are in these charter schools. And the same arguments were made against charter schools, saying, oh, you're just going to cream the best kids. You're going to take from the most advantaged families. Maybe you should open these up in some low-income areas, but we shouldn't be letting families take their kids and their funding away from the districts. It's going to blow up education, right? We've heard all these arguments against it. Those programs are open to anybody, regardless of their income, right? We said, we're not going to, again, pick winners and losers. We're going to just say, look, we believe in the idea of parental empowerment and innovation. And if families think they can get a better education somewhere else, and if teachers think, hey, maybe we don't want to just be in the kind of bureaucratic cookie cutter mold of the districts, we want to go to a charter school, we're going to allow that. And so, that model has been hugely successful. And I kind of throw this back on opponents of school choice to really think this through, right? They say, well, we shouldn't be paying for these families because they're the wrong background or they have too much income. Public schools, we don't means test our public schools, right? We don't say, well, look, there's a lot of wealthy families who could pay for schooling, but they're going to public schools at a cost of almost $15,000 a kid on the taxpayer's dime, right? We don't try and say, well, these kids are not deserving of it, right? We say the state believes we're going to provide educational opportunity for every kid, and we're going to do that. So unless you want to means test the public schools or start saying, sorry, you can't use public school choice if you're over a certain income threshold to go to a charter school, then it makes no sense, right? Because economically, every time one of those kids leaves a district and goes to a charter school or goes to even another district through open enrollment, all that money goes with them. So unless you think, well, you're too wealthy to go do that, you've already bought into the idea that says, look, we're not going to try and force a kid to go to a certain school based on where they live. We're going to say, we're going to treat everybody equally. And if it's a wealthy family who wants to choose school choice, they're doing that at a lower cost to the taxpayer than it would be if that kid was in a public school.
Yeah. I liked that you make this comparison to charter schools, and that's where I want to take this next, because I'm a huge fan of charter schools. I think they've been enormously beneficial, especially for students who are disadvantaged. And there's just a trove of evidence pointing to this. There can just be no doubt about how great charter schools are. So this analogy between charter schools and the ESA program is one I really am hopeful about. I hope this ESA program is like the charter program. I know you've mentioned in your debate, there's a lot of evidence coming out of CREDO, the Center for Research on Educational Outcomes, showing dramatic improvement in Arizona charter schools. So let's talk about the similarities between, or how a critic might point out the dissimilarities, and I'll get your response to this. So charter schools can't be selective. It's part of the model. Private schools, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but they can be a lot more selective. So that's where a critic will say there's a huge difference between the charter model and the ESA model, is that we're getting private schools who can now choose which students they want, and based on test scores, or however, I think test scores is generally the method for choosing, whereas charter schools are not allowed to have testing requirements. How do you reconcile that?
Yeah, another great question. And so one of the starting points would be, as you said, the evidence is very clear that charter schools have succeeded, right? The same applies to private education. So we've seen the data, even from center left or left leaning sources, have said, actually, even when you compare kids of similar backgrounds, how do they do in the public school system versus if they get into one of these programs? So the Brookings Institute, which is and the Urban Institute, of both groups like this. The Urban Institute, for instance, looked at the Florida Tax Credit Scholarship. This was the largest private choice program in the country, serving predominantly low-income kids. And they studied and said, okay, of the kids who tried to get on that program, can we kind of compare, right? This is apples to apples of students who are coming from these disadvantaged communities to see how did they do if they got on the program versus not. And they found they actually do better. So yes, it's a distinction in that private schools have admissions criteria. They can do this. But even when you look at how those kids do, who then say, yes, I was someone who could have been in the public school system and I got into private school, they tend to do better. So yes, it's true that the private schools have a little bit more autonomy. That's one of the features of saying, hey, look, we're going to, again, have less regulation about this. But we hear this argument about like, oh, well, they're discriminatory. They pick and choose students, right? We heard that during the debate at the ASU Law School recently, saying, well, there's, you might have students with disabilities who aren't allowed into a program, and so this is bad. We've seen 10,000 students with special needs get into the ESA program. So the other side is going to argue, well, there might be a school that doesn't take that student, and so obviously this whole experiment is bad. When I would turn that on their head and say 10,000 families just got into private education through other means. Maybe not every kid is matching with every school, right? There's schools that specialize. There's schools that specialize specifically in kids with these very, very significant special needs. And the schools do fantastic when those families were failed in the school district system, and now they're able to do it through the ESA. So the idea that while we're picking and choosing students that's not truly the objection, I think, from the opponents, because at the end of the day, right, the only people right now who can get into those private schools are the ones who can afford it. So if you want to talk about creating this system that's unequal, the current pre-ESA system of saying, yeah, you know what, you're stuck with the public school system unless your family can afford to buy your way into the private schools. Like the governor, right? We've heard from Katie Hobbs, her background was going into a public school. Now her family sacrificed and worked to do that, but we see this time and time again with particularly left-wing politicians who oppose school choice and say it's bad, it's all these things, and then they went there or they send their kids there, right? So the idea that we're going to say they get to pick and choose, so they're bad and they're unworthy of families having the chance to go there, I think is nonsense. We're seeing the elite, privileged, again, predominantly left-wing politicians who complain about it, but then turn around and try to use it. The ESA program says, just like you had access to a public school, now we're going to provide you financial access to the private market.
I think another really prominent criticism of the ESA movement, and this is one you hear a lot, and it's one I'm a very sympathetic towards ESAs, but I do have a bit of sympathy for this criticism, is the idea that what will happen under an ESA program is a sort of stratification where we have really high achieving students migrating to really high achieving schools with really good teachers. We know teachers like to teach better students more than they like to teach worse students, naturally. So we're going to have a sort of matching of the really high achieving students with the good teachers, and maybe we'll have a much lower achieving students who are operating in maybe public, maybe private schools where you have less poorer quality teachers, poorer quality schools for whatever reason, and there's sort of an inequality there. How seriously do you take that criticism?
Yeah, well, I take the concern seriously. I don't take the criticism seriously, right? The question, any question, right, about, hey, what are the impacts? Those are great to have and to delve into it. But there's two things that I think are starting points that we need to look at. If we want to talk about stratification, we should start by looking at the public school system, right? Because when you set aside school choice and you follow the model of what the teachers unions want of, right, you're going to go to your locally assigned district because we don't want you moving away because then there's fixed costs and it causes all these problems. I think that's their model. What that leads to is families being stratified, because now you have kids who have to go to a school based upon where they live. And so if you have a clustering of a disadvantaged community and those kids are all stuck going to their school, and all the other families say, I'm going to go buy a house somewhere else into this other district, that's the stratification that we see, right? If you have kids in the Roosevelt district over here, and you got kids in Scottsdale over here, right? If it's a high and low performing or high and low wealth district, that causes the stratification, right? That's historically how these school districts have operated. And so the idea that allowing families to kind of break away from this geographic mold that says, sorry, you live here, you're stuck here unless your family, happens to win the lottery, that I think is what has caused the stratification. In terms of, okay, well, what does school choice actually lead to? Again, the research folks from UC Davis and elsewhere have looked at this and said, how do the public schools do once you have private choice programs, once you have school choice? Are we seeing that then you have a bifurcation of the kids getting into this program do well, but everyone else struggles? The answer has been no. Actually, you tend to see rising tide lifts all boats, right? You see the kids on the program do well, but you also, the research shows, even those existing schools tend to do better. And it's not to say that we don't want to invest resources in everybody, right? But the left has this idea that says, in the name of equity and in the name of equality, we want everything to be the same, right? We've seen them take away advanced courses, gifted courses, right? They want everything to be the same. That's not in the interest of any students, high performing or low performing, right? You don't want the kid who's really advanced being bored in class, and you don't want the kid who's struggling to feel like he's way behind. So this notion of we need to jam everything together, not for the benefit of the students, but so that we can say, look, we've achieved equity, right? That's not a winning strategy. What is saying, we don't care where you're living. We don't care your background, your income, any of this. You have the same access. So if you're a family where your school district's not performing well, but you can't afford private school and in Arizona, we actually looked at this. The median tuition in Arizona was about on par with a typical ESA award, which means these families, even these low-income areas, like in the Roosevelt district, which is a 90% Hispanic and Black community, huge child poverty rates. Those kids can afford to go to any number of private schools in their area that otherwise is financially prohibitively costly, right? Even if it's $6,000 or $7,000, if those families can't afford it, they're stuck going to their public school, stratified again from those who have an opportunity to go to a more well-run, functioning education environment.
I think the more I think about the ESA program, in my mind, I come up with all of these potential problems, but then I realize that a lot of it comes down to it's better than the alternative. Um, there's just it, there's natural inequality in any system, and that includes the public school system. So any problem I think about with the ESA program, I tend to think about the alternative, which is a poorly performing government run public school, which is not very responsive to the needs of parents. So, in general, I think the more I dwell on the ESA program, the more I come to believe that increased parental choice and increased competition in the market for education is a better way forward. Um,
Yeah. And I think that, again, you're someone who's trying to think this through. You're asking the questions. You're not just trying to blindly take talking points. You're trying to think through what are the academic ramifications? What are the financial ramifications? And just like you said earlier, right, the charters to you are a no-brainer, right? They are such a huge win. Those things, there are even states today that hardly have any charter schools because the establishment has said, if you do this, think of all the terrible things that could happen, right? So we've already seen this trajectory play out in the past of charter schools aren't a silver bullet, private school choice isn't a silver bullet, but if they're both steps in the right direction, to your point, it's none of these are going to independently solve all education problems or all the issues that we have in the country. But if they make it better, if they improve the opportunity and access to educational excellence for students, yes, you are comparing that to the existing system and saying, is this better on the whole or is it worse? And so I think you're absolutely right as you think through that and say, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. Yes, you can still find things that you're going to have issues here and there, but on the whole, are they going to be better than the other system? And the last point I would note on that, these systems are not, nobody's forced into it, right? Nobody's required to go to a charter school. We're not saying we're taking apart a public school district and that doesn't operate and you have to go to this privately run, right? It's saying if you would like to, if you would choose, we've seen all these arguments now against how the ESA program doesn't provide. The Attorney General came out and said, you're forfeiting all these rights that you have, all these federal government guarantees that you have in the public school system. If you have special needs, you're going to lose that if you go on the ESA program. So should we say, sorry, parents, we don't trust you to take care of your kids because maybe you lose some government guarantee? No, these are the same families who all those government guarantees have failed, right? For years, their kids have struggled in the system. And we've said, look, we're not pushing you out. We're not forcing you out. But if you would like to opt into a different system, you can. It's not going to be perfect, but the testimony from parents who have been in this program for 10 years, one after another, right? This program has been incredible. So why would we take that away as opposed to, as you said, the alternative of just keep them where they are?
a lot of the concern about the ESA program is that there's going to be a lot of money wasted. One comeback to that is, well, there's a lot of waste in the public school system. I think that's a really good counter argument. But I don't think you can deny that in any system like the ESA program, there will be money spent inefficiently. So one solution to this is a very radical solution, is to just get the government out of the business entirely. We don't want, there's some assumptions about we need to subsidize education. It's mandatory that we compel people to pursue. Why not just privatize the whole thing?
So a couple of reasons, right? In Arizona, as in other states, it is a state constitutional mandate, right? The state is required by the state constitution. This isn't even something that lawmakers can go in and change, even if they wanted to, right? It is required by the Arizona state constitution to provide the system of public education, right? So the state is financially tied to doing this. They are absolutely required by the constitution to do it. So back to your point, take that as a given, right? The state is going to be providing and ensuring that educational options are essentially financially available. So then the question is, should it only come from the state, or should we allow public contractors via charter schools, or essentially parents being that recipient of those funds? So from a social perspective, certainly there is a desire to limit government. I mean, we all share that, but operating within that assumption of, look, we think that education is something that actually provides equal opportunity, right? We don't want to be equalizing outcomes. Again, the left is all about trying to say, well, we need affirmative action down at the end of the pipeline because kids had different outcomes. No, what we need to do is provide options so that kids, regardless of their background, regardless of where they're coming from, are able to then thrive and succeed. And so something like the ESA program says, look, state constitution is very clear. The state of Arizona provides this financial backing, again, $15,000 per kid all in. When you look at state, federal, and local, it's $12,000 from just Arizona taxpayers alone, just state and local. $12,000 a kid is essentially the required amount to be going that gets spent on kids in public school. We trust that parents can do it. And yes, there's going to be funds that, you're going to say, well, I don't know that was the best use of resources. Again, as you said, the public school system is going to, we've seen whether it's the Buckeye superintendent, is $1 million of excess compensation, school districts, all sorts of things. The ESA program rate of misspending fraud is lower than what we see in other government programs. So yes, there's always going to be, and the Department of Education, they go through and they review these receipts. I mean, one of the challenges for parents has actually been that there is so much oversight and so many extra hurdles to say, you've got to document everything that you're spending here. If anything, is that the parents struggle with the burden of compliance in this program because there's such a push to make sure that all the funds in this program are spent in keeping with the statute.
Gotcha. I think that's a really good answer. And it does make sense. We are constrained by the legal system we have in place. And I guess I'd like to where can we find out more about the Goldwater Institute, and what are you guys up to right now?
Sure. We have our website, goldwaterinstitute.org, and we are active on a number of issues on school choice, obviously doing events. The debate we just had recently, we've been putting out on our website information about the ESA program, facts about it, the finances, a lot of the same conversation that we just had for folks who are interested in actually learning about the program as opposed to just hearing a soundbite, from the teachers union. So again, really appreciate you giving an opportunity to come on and talk about the program. And I appreciate you again, being an example of somebody who's trying to thoughtfully walk through this question and come to, okay, what's the best solution for kids? And school choice is one of those solutions that empowers parents and empowers students.
Matt, thank you so much for being on the program.
Thanks for having me.